At 10:51 p.m. on April 29, 1975, Ambassador Graham Martin walked out of the United States Embassy in Saigon carrying a folded American flag under his arm. He was the last American ambassador to the Republic of South Vietnam. Behind him, inside the embassy compound, approximately 400 Vietnamese who had been promised evacuation were still waiting. The helicopter that took Martin to the USS Blue Ridge did not come back for them that night. The next morning, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace, and the war was over. Those 400 Vietnamese waited through the night in a compound that was already, functionally, abandoned. Think about that. The fall of Saigon did not begin on April 30th, 1975. It began on April 29th, when a rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut Air Base killed 2 U.S. Marines, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge, the last American combat deaths of the Vietnam War, and destroyed the runway, making fixed-wing evacuation impossible. That rocket attack compressed everything. The plans that had existed for an orderly evacuation by fixed-wing aircraft, plans that had been prepared and revised and prepared again for months, were rendered obsolete in the space of a single morning. What replaced them was Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history, conducted under fire, in chaos, with inadequate assets and an impossible timeline. The CIA had been watching the North Vietnamese advance with increasing alarm since January. By April, the intelligence picture was unambiguous. Saigon was going to fall. The question was when, and the answer kept moving closer. On April 21st, President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned and fled the country. His resignation speech, broadcast on Vietnamese radio, lasted 90 minutes and included a denunciation of Henry Kissinger and the United States government that was specific, bitter, and not entirely inaccurate. Thieu accused the Americans of having promised military support that was never delivered. He was not wrong. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 had contained a secret protocol in which Nixon promised Thieu continued military assistance. Watergate ended Nixon's presidency before that promise could be kept, and Congress, exhausted by the war, had cut off funding for further military involvement in Southeast Asia. Thieu had been told his country would be supported. It had not been. The American community in Saigon in April 1975 consisted of approximately 6,000 people, including embassy personnel, military advisors operating under the Defense Attaché Office, CIA officers, journalists, contractors, and the family members of South Vietnamese employees who had been promised protection. The embassy's planning had consistently underestimated how many people would need to leave and overestimated the time available to get them out. Ambassador Martin, a stubborn and deeply loyal diplomat who had lost his own son in the Vietnam War, refused to authorize the full evacuation until it was almost too late, because authorizing it meant admitting that Saigon was falling, and Martin was not ready to admit that until the evidence was physically outside his window. The signal for Operation Frequent Wind was a radio broadcast. At 10:51 a.m. on April 29th, the Armed Forces Radio Network in Saigon played the recording of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. This was the pre-arranged signal to American personnel throughout the city that the final evacuation had begun. They were to proceed immediately to designated pickup points. Destroy classified documents, abandon everything else. The song played, the city heard it, and thousands of South Vietnamese who understood what it meant began moving toward the embassy. What followed was controlled chaos, achieving heroic outcomes through individual effort rather than institutional competence. The CH-46 Sea Knight and CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters of the U.S. Navy and Marines flew continuously from ships in the South China Sea to landing zones in Saigon and back. The primary landing zone was the roof of the embassy itself, a space designed to accommodate small helicopters that was now receiving aircraft in continuous rotation. The secondary zones were throughout the city. Pilots flew through the night, accumulating flight hours that far exceeded safe operational limits, refueling on deck and turning around immediately. One pilot, Marine Major James Keane, flew 11 consecutive missions before dawn. The images from that night are among the most recognizable in the history of American foreign policy. The photograph taken by UPI photographer Hubert Van Ness showing a helicopter on a rooftop with Vietnamese civilians climbing a ladder toward it, has been misidentified for 50 years as showing the U.S. Embassy. It is actually showing the roof of an apartment building at 22 Gia Long Street, used as a CIA residential facility. The actual embassy evacuation looked different. More helicopters, more chaos, more people, more desperation. But Van S's photograph captured something true about the night, even if the specific location was misidentified. People were climbing toward helicopters. People were being left behind. The capacity problem was brutal and simple. Operation Frequent Winds planning had assumed approximately 3,000 people would need to be evacuated. By the time the evacuation began, the number had swelled to something closer to 7,000, and the South Vietnamese gathering outside the embassy walls numbered in the tens of thousands. The helicopters could carry a limited number of people per trip. The math did not work. Decisions were being made on the tarmac and on rooftops about who got on and who did not. CIA officer Frank Snepp, who was working inside the embassy throughout the evacuation, later described the anguish of watching South Vietnamese employees who had worked for the agency for years being left outside the gates. People who had risked their lives for the American cause. People who had been explicitly promised that they would be taken care of. The gates were closed. They were not taken care of. The South Vietnamese Air Force conducted its own evacuation in parallel, a fact that created one of the most surreal military situations of the entire war. South Vietnamese pilots, understanding that staying meant imprisonment or death under the new government, flew their aircraft, helicopters, fixed-wing planes, any aircraft they could get airborne, out to sea toward the American fleet. U.S. Navy vessels found themselves receiving a continuous stream of South Vietnamese military aircraft whose pilots had nowhere else to go. The Navy's solution was pragmatic and heartbreaking. Aircraft were landed, the crew and passengers were taken aboard, and the aircraft were pushed over the side into the South China Sea to make room for the next one. Tens of millions of dollars worth of military equipment sank into the ocean. The alternative was leaving people to die. Inside the embassy, the shredding and burning of classified documents had begun days earlier and intensified through the night of April 29th. CIA officers worked through fires fueled by classified cables and personnel files, destroying the record of who had worked for the agency, who had been on the American payroll, who might be identified and killed by the incoming government. Some records were destroyed that should have been saved. Some people whose identities might have been protected were exposed when the destruction process failed to keep up with the timeline. The fire in the embassy courtyard burned all night. At 4:58 a.m. on April 30th, the last Marine Guards at the embassy, a detachment of 11 men under Major Jim Keane, were ordered to withdraw. They had spent the night managing the evacuation from the roof and the compound, managing the crowds, managing the chaos. As they lifted off in the final helicopter, they left behind the American flag that had flown over the embassy. They had been told to bring it. There was no time. The flag stayed. At 8 a.m., North Vietnamese tanks approached the presidential palace. General Duong Van Minh, who had assumed the presidency 3 days earlier specifically to negotiate a surrender, gave the order for South Vietnamese forces to lay down their arms. At 11:30 a.m., Tank 843 of the 203rd Tank Brigade crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. A North Vietnamese soldier ran across the lawn and raised a flag on the palace flagpole. The war was over. In the immediate aftermath, the people who had not gotten out began to understand what that meant. Senior South Vietnamese military officers and government officials were sent to re-education camps, some for years, some for decades. South Vietnamese soldiers were imprisoned, the women who had worked with Americans faced persecution, the Amerasian children, already outcasts, became targets, the Vietnamese employees of American companies and agencies who had been left behind negotiated their survival as best they could. Some survived, some did not. The 2 Marines who died in the rocket attack that morning, Charles McMahon of Woburn, Massachusetts, and Darwin Judge of Marshalltown, Iowa, were 21 and 19 years old respectively. They are the last names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. At the very bottom of the wall, the final entries in a list that begins in 1959. McMahon had been in Vietnam for 2 weeks. Judge had been there for 6 weeks. They died on the last day, in the last hours, of a war that had been functionally over for years. The helicopter that took Ambassador Martin to the fleet did not go back for the 400 Vietnamese still waiting in the embassy compound. They were eventually evacuated by other aircraft later that morning. But they spent the night in a compound that had already been abandoned by the country that had promised to protect them, listening to the sounds of a city falling, waiting for a helicopter that had already left. Some of them are still in the United States today. Some returned to Vietnam after normalization of relations in 1995. Some died in re-education camps before they could be evacuated at all. The war produced no clean endings. It produced only the specific weight of specific decisions made by specific people in specific moments of crisis, and the consequences those decisions carried, and carry still, for the people who were present for all of it and never entirely left. There is a video on screen right now about the human cost of the Vietnam War's final years and the people who paid it. Subscribe. These are the stories that don't end just because the war did.